Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, John, and thanks everybody for coming along. This is going to be a little bit of an experiment, and I should explain that it is about work in progress. I've been blogging on etymology as a kind of a sideline from working on Irish names, mainly Irish place names, for the last 2 years. And the blog is ongoing, and this is really kind of reporting on what I've found so far. Okay, so it is not definitive, but I think I've found enough interest to make it quite interesting. I hope that everything will be understandable. It should be possible to follow this talk regardless of whether you have Irish, regardless of whether you have Latin or any Romance languages. If you have some Irish, if you have some Latin, if you have some French or another Romance language, you may get a little bit more out of it, but it shouldn't be necessary. I hope I've remembered to translate everything. If there's anything that isn't clear, it's probably best if you just interrupt me. I'm quite easygoing about that. As long as only a kind of quick question, if I can resolve it, what does that mean? I'm quite happy to do these things on the hoof. So yeah, I hope I haven't used sort of too much kind of technical linguistic terminology. And yeah, I should say thank you very much to the Classical Association in Northern Ireland for the invitation. This kind of came about because I work in the winter as a library assistant, and I know Erin Halliday, who's a member of the association here, and it was Erin actually who suggested originally that the association might be interested in this topic. So, and by the way, in case you're wondering where that is, I'm not going to tell you. Okay, it's to tantalize you. I'm going to tell you at the end. Okay, but if you knew, and maybe some people do know, you could more or less write the conclusions. There's not really any firm conclusions. There's some kind of remarks, because as I say, with the work in progress, there's not really definitive conclusions yet. But suffice to say, it is not in Ireland, but there is an Irish link. Okay. So, what am I going to cover? As a preliminary to talking about the etymology of some particular Irish words that I've focused on in the last while, I'm going to talk briefly about the position of Irish in the Indo-European languages, in the family of Indo-European languages, and Irish's relationship to Latin. Then I'm going to talk briefly about the current state of Irish etymology, which is really necessary to explain kind of why I got into this. I was tempted to put some other adjective in between the words current and state, but I refrained. Then I'm going to this is the meat really of the talk. I'm going to present some new etymological proposals for some specific words in early Irish. Okay. So when I talk about early Irish, what I mean is the Irish that's attested in the first few centuries of Irish literature. So from about 600, from the year 600 AD onwards. So Old Irish was the first, like 600 say to 800 roughly, and Middle Irish 800 to 1000 AD. Okay. That's what I mean technically by early Irish, and it is the main period covered by the Dictionary of the Irish Language, which is a very important source and is available online. Okay. And then I'm going to end with some remarks about the significance of these proposals, because you will see that a theme develops with them. Okay. So, first of all, I should say a little bit about what kind of language Irish is. Okay, and starting from the most general, linguists classify Irish as an Indo-European language. Okay, that is a very, very broad family of languages. It covers most of the languages in Europe. Okay, not all. It doesn't cover, for example, Finnish, Hungarian, and Basque, but it covers most of the languages in Europe, and that includes English. That includes Latin, French, and other Romance languages, and it includes also quite a lot of Asian languages, but there are many Asian languages which are not Indo-European. Okay, so it's Indo-European. Then, getting more specific, it's a Celtic language. Okay, so Celtic is a family within Indo-European. Okay. And there are 6 modern Celtic languages. We have Irish, along with Scottish Gaelic and Manx Gaelic, and we have the Brittonic languages, Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. And then there are various languages which were spoken in Europe. The best known of these is Gaulish, so spoken in Gaul, what is now France and Western Germany, this side of the Rhine, Switzerland, northern Italy, and so on. And there are other Celtic languages that we know a little bit about, mainly through Roman and Greek sources. Okay. So, as I've already hinted, then getting more specific, within the Celtic languages, Irish can be defined as a Goidelic language. And Goidelic is just Gaelic. Okay, it's just a fancy linguist words for Gaelic. Okay, Old Irish is actually perceived as the parent language of Scottish Gaelic and Manx as well. So it's in a parent kind of relationship. They're not all going back to some Proto-Goidelic language. It's believed that Scottish Gaelic and Manx can be explained in terms of the earliest form of Irish because of migrations, essentially. However, Irish has some elements which are not typically Celtic or Indo-European. Okay. A lot of Celticists have tended to emphasize the Celtic and Indo-European, but there are elements in the vocabulary and particularly in the grammar which are not typically Celtic or Indo-European. Okay, and it's not really very remarkable because so does Latin. Okay, there's a lot of things in Latin that you can't explain. You can't take them back to Indo-European roots. And sometimes we know why. Sometimes it's because of some substrate like Etruscan or some kind of more perhaps vaguer, widespread substrate in the Mediterranean. Sometimes it's simply not clear. And most of the Indo-European languages, you can say the very same thing. I know that, for example, with German, it's been calculated that almost a third of the vocabulary is not Indo-European. Not only not Germanic, but not Indo-European. So it's not unusual. Okay, what that means in the case of Irish is there may be elements in Irish in the vocabulary and also in the grammar that Irish doesn't share with earlier Celtic languages, doesn't share with other Indo-European languages like Latin or English, but that may go back to something earlier, okay, that was in Ireland perhaps before an Indo-European language arrived here. Okay, what about the relationship of Irish to Latin? Irish and Latin are connected in a number of different ways. First of all, they both have a common Indo-European origin, as I've pointed out. Okay, so Irish is within Celtic, Latin is within a group that's usually called Italic, but most of the surviving languages, virtually all of the surviving languages that are Italic, that are spoken today, are actually descended from Latin. We call them Romance, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and so on. Okay. Secondly, they actually have a lot more in common than just being Indo-European, because Italic is the most closely related subfamily within Indo-European to Celtic, and they are so closely related that there was a theory which is now generally discounted, but the reasons why this theory developed are still valid. There was a theory of a period of Italo-Celtic unity. So it was suggested that after the Indo-European broke up into different families, that the ancestors of the Celts and the Italic peoples, including the Romans, actually lived together for some time before those two groups split. That idea was kind of popular in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and it's generally discounted now. But the reasons for it are that they are quite close. Sometimes it's because they've interacted, and sometimes it's because of common origin. Okay. Now, the relationship that Irish has with Latin is quite different to a lot of other languages, right? And the reason for this is, well, if Richard Warner were here, I wouldn't dare say this, but the reason is the Romans did not invade Ireland. Okay, now there is certainly Roman influence, and one can debate to what extent Roman mercenaries may have scouted and perhaps put a foothold and so on. But certainly Ireland was not colonized in the same way that the neighbouring island was, at least up to the walls, Hadrian's Wall, Antonine Wall, and large areas of continental Europe. So Irish doesn't have that relationship of having been colonized by Rome, by native speakers of Latin. Okay. In continental Europe, Celtic languages were very, very widely spoken up to about 2,000 years ago. And depending on the area, it may be a little bit before 2,000 years ago. It may be a little bit after. The Celtic languages were very, very widespread in Europe and went as far down as modern Turkey. And, they went east to areas like Bohemia and west to Spain. Okay, there was a language called Celt-Iberian, okay, which was sort of related to Gaulish. Irish doesn't have that history. Latin came into contact with Irish in the early Middle Ages because of the spread of Christianity. and because Latin was the language of the church. And so the relationship is different. I should say that in large areas of continental Europe, Celtic languages were replaced either by Latin and languages descended from Latin, the Romance languages, or by Germanic languages, because the Germanic peoples also spread enormously. And while they didn't have a coherent empire, they did spread out from a much smaller centre, and much of the ground that they took and which the Germanic languages took, they replaced an earlier Celtic language there. Okay, and basically the areas that were left with Celtic languages in the Middle Ages then were Britain and Ireland and Brittany. Okay, and even that was because of colonization from Britain. That's why it's called Brittany, not because Celts stayed there, but because they actually went from southwest Britain. So Celtic languages once very, very widespread in Europe. They ended up in the Middle Ages and then up to the current situation where they are in Britain and Ireland, particularly in the more remote parts where English hasn't, where the influence of English hasn't been so strong. Okay, Latin loanwords in early Irish, which is essentially what I'm looking at. Okay, and I started looking really at Latin, and then it took a slight diversion, but we'll say Latin loanwords in Irish to start with. The orthodox view is that most of these loanwords are connected with religion or the running of the church, or even if they aren't, it's because of the influence of the church. And sometimes it's very difficult to tell. With words like the Irish word padger, okay, which is a prayer, should have translated that, shouldn't I? Padger is a prayer. It doesn't mean father, it means prayer, okay? But it comes from the pater of pater noster, our father. You can see the connection, okay? And the Irish sagart, a priest, comes from Latin sacerdos, which also means a priest, okay? And originally comes from, I think it's got a Greek root. There are other words, even like muillin, mill, where you would think, well, that's got nothing to do with the church. But actually, it's because of the influence of the church, because there weren't too many people who had the capacity to build mills, but the monks did because of their large numbers and high degree of organization. So even words like that get attributed to the influence of the church. It's recognized that many of these words don't just come from classical Latin, and of course they were borrowed in the early Middle Ages. So Christianity arrived in Ireland probably a little bit before St. Patrick, maybe a decade or two before St. Patrick, in the 5th century. Okay, so we're not talking about classical Latin. We're talking maybe they thought they spoke classical Latin, but they perhaps it was probably influenced by Vulgar Latin, and it was definitely Latin with a Brittonic accent, maybe with a Welsh accent or something like that. Okay, Latin with a Welsh accent, and we know because certain changes happen. So, for example, the Irish word pogue, meaning kiss, actually comes from the Latin pax, peace, because a kiss was a religious sign of peace. Okay, and it should kind of develop to a C, because pax, parkis, and so on. There's a k in most of the forms, but it becomes a G, That's typical of Welsh, and the fact that the long A changed to a long O is also typical of Brittonic languages. And you can say a similar thing about Nolig, our word for Christmas, okay, which comes from natalicia, natalizia, I suppose, in medieval Latin. Again, you've got a change of A to O, and you've got the C becoming a G, so becoming voiced, and these are typically Brittonic. The Swiss scholar Rudolf Thurneisen identified these, and he sets them out in his Grammar of Old Irish. Now, when we're dealing with Irish links to Latin, we need to distinguish between equivalents, words which have a common origin, and actual borrowings. So the ones I mentioned before are actual borrowings, loan words, okay? But there are other words that are related because Irish and Latin are Indo-European, and the Celtic and Italic are closely related. So you get words like ahar, father, related to Latin pater. The P is gone, but that's a characteristic of Celtic. Initial P is lost, okay? But it's not a borrowing from Latin. It's because they both come down from an Indo-European source. And the Irish in particular has gone through certain changes characteristic of Irish or Celtic. So we need to distinguish those, okay? I'm principally talking about loan words, okay? Right, okay. The state of Irish etymology. I'm going to try and do this quickly. You might think, oh, they've had long enough. They've been kind of working on it for 200 years. Isn't all of this wrapped up? You know? Not really, okay? If you look at Irish etymological dictionaries, specifically Irish etymological dictionaries, the most complete Irish etymological dictionary is in French and covers the letters A to D and M to U. And there's a gap in the middle of the alphabet, okay, from E to L that has not yet been covered. And no volume has come out in this project since 1996. Maybe it will, you know, but it will need a whole new team of scholars. It was work conducted by a French scholar called Joseph Vendries, and then his students who then also edited later volumes. So you need to read French in order to access this dictionary, okay? About Old Irish, and it's specifically about Old Irish. A little bit easier to read because it's in English. There is an etymological dictionary of the Gaelic language, but I should maybe say Gaelic, you see, because it's not Gaelic as in Irish, it's Gaelic as in Scottish Gaelic, okay? And it's by Alexander MacBain, Scottish scholar, and the fact that it deals with Scottish Gaelic means that there's quite a lot of words which Irish has, but Scottish Gaelic doesn't have, that are not going to be covered. Okay, and we'll see one or two of those. And it's quite old. Okay, second edition, 1911. Okay. Much more recent, there is a very interesting resource, Etymological Dictionary of Proto-Celtic, by Ranko Matasovic, who I think is Croatian. It's complete, it's a finished book. My goodness, it's expensive, but there is a copy of it here in the library, and it deals with all the Celtic languages. But because it's general, you know, there is not massively detailed coverage of Irish, so a lot of Irish words are not mentioned, especially when Irish is the only language to have these words. He's interested in the words that are shared between Irish and the other Celtic languages. Okay. And then in German, but now available in English translation in the, I don't know, I think in about the last 10 years, very important resource. There is an Indo-German etymological dictionary, Indo-Germanisches Etymologisches Wörterbuch, Julius Pokorny, a sort of German Czech scholar, and he deals with all the Indo-European languages. So Irish is mentioned, but as an example of, Celtic. And again, a lot of words are not covered. If they're only in Irish and there's no connection to be made, Pokorny doesn't tend to mention them. Okay. There are some very important ordinary regular dictionaries, not etymological dictionaries. The Dictionary of the Irish Language very often has some etymological notes, or it has some spelling variants for words in medieval texts, and that's very important. And since about 15 years ago, that's available online, which is a huge boon for this kind of work. There's a number of dictionaries of modern Irish, and I mentioned my favourite here. Is really recognised as an incredible labour of love by one man, Father Patrick Dineen, Kerryman. He compiled this before the sort of spelling reforms in modern Irish, but it's quite easy to work with, and it often has more notes on related words to the head word than some of the other sources. Okay. So he's often a mine of very useful information. And then I want to mention some other sources that are very important. Of course, you need a Latin dictionary if you're going to work on this, and this was my main source, Lewis and Short. Unfortunately, that's available online as well. There is a very good dictionary of the Welsh language, which goes also back into the historical variants, and that's available online. And very often that mentions the Celtic cognates of Irish words, the equivalents, like where I was saying Latin pater, Irish ahar, they're equivalents and they've come down from a common source. So this dictionary, Dictionary of the Welsh Language, often gives you the Celtic cognates of Welsh words, particularly including the Irish. And there are many, many articles, of course. You can't just simply work through the dictionaries. You need to kind of scan the articles. The one that I just mentioned one as an example, and it's the one that has been most useful for me in preparing this talk, A Chronology of Latin Loanwords in Early Irish by Damien McManus, who's a scholar at Trinity in Dublin. Incredibly helpful. I could also mention work by T.F. O'Rahilly in the early 20th century, but there are many, many others. So now on to what Tempan is presenting, okay, and kind of challenging in some cases some of the conventional ideas, or trying to fill a gap where there maybe hasn't been anything available. Okay, I got interested in this topic because when I was doing my thesis about place names that John referred to, I was looking at unusual Irish words that crop up in place names, and there's an awful lot of them where you find a word that maybe is only in 10 Irish place names, and yet it's there, you've got a pretty good idea of what it means, and maybe it means something to do with the rock feature or moorland or some kind of water feature. It may not be in the dictionary. That's how I got into this, and I tried to analyse where the words that I was looking at, the difficult words that the dictionary wasn't very good in covering, where they came from, and tried to analyse, are they Celtic words? Are they words that Irish has borrowed from some other source, from Latin or from English or something else, So one of the interesting words that I've always been into is Skellig, okay? And I'm putting it up there as Skellig, Spellig, Balak, okay? But that's my grouping. All of these words refer to some kind of rock feature. And you'll probably, I mean, I haven't translated it because, you know, it's too broad, but you'll probably know it as the name Skellig, as in the Skellig Islands, Skellig Michael, the monastery off the coast of County Kerry. I'm also going to look at Arch, a place, Allin, beautiful, Born, white, Realtor, a star, and Imad, wooden timber. Out of all of those, only the first one is a word that you won't generally find in dictionaries. All the others are really common words, okay, that you could use any day in a conversation in Irish, okay? Hopefully some of them are familiar. There are some other words that I've treated in my blog. I've been blogging on this for 2 years on academia, and there's a few words like liar, which is usually kind of translated as a stream fork or a confluence or something like that, but I think it just means slope. Moher, a wood or a thicket, or also by transfer a ruin, and you'll know that from the cliffs of Moher, okay? And the word corha, referring to a standing stone, which seems to be a synonym for galon, some kind of commemorative stone or standing stone. But I'm not going to deal with them. I'm going to deal with the first 6. So, Skellig, Spellig, Balak. Of these 3, only the first one is treated by dictionaries really at all. No, sorry, that's not true. Balak is mentioned by dictionaries, but not by etymological dictionaries. If you look in the dictionary of the Irish language, you'll find Skellig, despite the C is actually pronounced Skellig. That's how Old Irish C is pronounced in that case, and sort of meaning a rock, stone, or crag. And it's a feminine word, which is significant, okay? I'm very often interested in what gender the word is. Old Irish had 3 genders, like Latin. Now 2 in modern Irish. So, what explanations were there? Well, not much. Pokorny mentioned it in his Indo-European etymological dictionary. He said that it came from an Indo-European root, kel or skell, that meant to cut. And you can talk about the word scalp in English that may fit into that. And he had plenty of other examples as well in other languages. And then Vondries said really that there was no satisfactory explanation, didn't really agree with Pokorny, but didn't really put up his own solid proposal. The word is known mainly for place names in each case, not many, okay? Skellig, Spellig and Balak are treated, if they're treated by the dictionaries at all, as 3 separate entities, okay? I would agree that they have become 3 separate entities, but I think they've actually got a common origin. So, if you know these words, you probably know that from maybe these 2 names, particularly the first, Skellig Vihil, the island of Skellig Michael in County Kerry. And there's also Champel na Skellige, anglicised as Temple na Skellig at Glendalough. The form Spellig occurs in the north, mainly in Ulster, but in County Louth there is Skellig and Latin, which appears to mean some. Well, I think if you take it meaning rock, it's like rock of the raven. Okay, but I think it actually means something like lair or den, or as it's a raven, nest. Okay. I think it's more specific than that. And then you have Spelgach, okay, anglicised as Spelga. You'll know the Spelga Dam and so on, and there's a hill in the Mourns where the, let me get it right, where the Ban rises. Am I right? Where the Ban rises, not the Lagan, but the Ban rises. And that's got a ach ending on it. So it's Spelg with an ach sort of suffix adjectival suffix. And then an example of Balak. Balak means a rock shelter. It's something like a cave under a natural rock, and very often used by shepherds, and it's specific to Kerry and Cork. Okay, so it was a kind of rock shelter used by shepherds as a place to shelter in bad weather, or possibly even bring a few sheep in. Okay? So Balak na Clinne Galda is one cave where it said that O'Sullivans hid. They were all O'Sullivans around there. I know some of them. So when they were on the run, they went to this place. I'm not quite sure what they were called, Unclun Galda. Okay, but that's in South Kerry, very near the border with Cork. Okay, some visuals finally. That is Skellig Vichil, Skellig Michael, and can you see a path there? The monastery, founded in the 6th century, is up there. Okay, and that is how the monks got up there from the mooring. Nobody's allowed to go that way. If you go there now on a boat trip, you land at the same place. You have to walk round here and then up by the pilgrim's route. These are the monks' huts, and then you also have this is a chapel which is very similar to Gullerus Oratory, if you know that, on the Dingle Peninsula, not too far away. They may actually date back to the 6th century, it's possible. They're beehive huts, dry stone huts. And in the distance you can see Skellig Viog, small Skellig, which is a nature reserve, gannet colony. And you can see it again there, that's Skellig Viog in the distance. This is the easy way up. This is the pilgrim's route, okay? Now, the monastery was up here on a kind of terrace just before the, well, it's more or less on the top of this. This is kind of, Skellig is a twin-peaked island. But the higher peak, I have my back to the higher peak, I'm on the slope when I took this picture, and there is also a monk's hermitage. Now you would need to be some rock climber to get up there, but I mean it was normal. But nowadays you'd want to be a rock climber to get up there. Okay, there was a known hermitage spot, which was like a little shelter with a view facing out to the ocean, facing away from the mainland. Didn't want to be distracted. Okay. Sorry, going the wrong way, aren't I? Right. On now to the second example. Champel na Skellige is at Glendalough. Okay, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Glendalough. You can see there the round tower. The round tower, St Kevin's Kitchen, one of the churches, part of the cathedral. This is the monastic city. This was also founded in the 6th century in County Wicklow. Wicklow's not quite as remote as Skellig Vichil, but it was pretty remote. Okay, it was a long way from Dublin, and of course it would have been quite hard to get to. But Kevin also sought out places that were even more remote because people started to come here. Oops, sorry, too much. Okay. There are a lot of churches at Glendalough in remote places. One of them is this Reefort Church, about 2 kilometres away from the monastic city. And then Temple na Skellig is literally Church of the Rock by the upper loch, about 3 kilometres from the monastic city. And you can see that there is a cliff face there. So it's usually taken to be the Church of the Crag or the Rock, referring to that crag. But over on this side, there is a specific site which looks like this, okay? And it's called Llabach Chivin, St. Kevin's Bed. And that was where Kevin went, this is the tradition, when he wanted to pray or meditate and be away even from the hubbub of the monastic city. Okay. Now, I am wondering if Skellig could be from Latin spelunca. Spelunca means a cave in Latin, okay? And it also, sometimes it's a neutral word, sometimes though it definitely has overtones, you know, a lair, a den of iniquity. My wife Christina is Polish. Spelunka, it's not a good place to hang out, is it, in Polish? No, it's a place of ill repute. That it's gone from Latin into Polish with that kind of connotation. But it sometimes just means a remote place, a lair, a place where somebody went to be on their own, okay? And I think that fits here. The regular development, if it was a very old word, would be spellig. And of course we have that, but we only have it in the northern place names. It's not in any of the dictionaries, so I think that's why the connection hasn't been made. And I think that you can justify saying that the Skellig is a southern variant, because they didn't like the letter P. They didn't like the sound P. And for example, the Irish word for Easter is Cosc, right? From Pascha. They had no P in early Irish. Okay, it had been lost, and they tended to replace it with something else, and it was usually C. There were different ideas about why this was, but they even did it with the name Patricius, the name of our patron saint. So for some centuries he was referred to as Cothricia. Okay, and then after a few centuries, by about the 7th century, the form Pádraig established itself, and the P became integrated as an acceptable sound in Irish. So I would argue that the sp was changed to sk, you know, for the same reason that initial P was changed to C. So, Skellig appears in some southern names. There are more names in Kerry other than just Skellig Vigil. Spellig occurs in some of the northern names. I've mentioned some of them. There's more. And Balak is specific to Cork and Kerry. So that's my suggestion, that they all come from spelunca, meaning a cave, den or lair. Spellig would be the regular development. Skellig and Balak are different reactions to the fact that P is considered unacceptable in early Irish, and you've got to do something with it. So in one case they've changed sp to ska, because they had lots of native words with that combination. And changing a P to a B is another reaction. You've also lost the S. You know, I argued a case, you can look at the blog, but I'm not going to go into it here. But basically, we've got to get rid of that P somehow. That's my argument. And it can either become sk or it can become b, which is fine. B in Irish is no problem. Skellig and Spellig appear to have developed from something specific, cave, den, lair, to something more general, like a rock or a crag. And in a lot of the Irish place names, we've only got something as general as rock or crag. But in Temple na Skellig, we appear to have retained the meaning, because the church is right near St. Kevin's Bed. And I believe that it was the temple of the Hermit's Cave. Okay? It's only like 300 or 400 meters from it along the shore. Possibly Skellig Vigil is as well, given that there was a hermitage, or just the remoteness of the island, you could say it was a kind of a remote hideaway for the monks in general, the whole island. So possibly that retains the sense of spelunca in a way. The borrowing, if I'm right, must be very, very early, because Damien McManus has no examples of Latin words borrowed so early that they undergo this change, which he maintains happened before 400 AD. So the combination unk in spelunca changes to a G, a G, and unt to D. Okay, two similar changes. What we've got is unk to G. Okay, that happens to native Celtic words, but I know of no other example of a Latin word. So I believe that it was borrowed very early. Of course, people will say, "Oh, Tempan is wrong." That's kind of evidence that it wasn't borrowed at all, you know. But anyway, Arch, a place, and I'm going to kind of speed up now. Arch is a familiar word meaning a place, a situation. Sometimes it means a dwelling or an abode. Okay, it's feminine. In Old Irish, it's sometimes written with two T's, which is significant because I think it comes from something with two T's but separate, and the vowel has disappeared. Okay, yeah, this is complicated, but previous explanations. A Danish scholar called Pedersen proposed that there was an Indo-European root, something like porthni, and that the Latin word pons, pontis meaning a bridge, and various Sanskrit words, some of them to do with position and some of them to do with moving, like panthas, away, that they all came from this Indo-European root. Matasovich is not convinced by the phonology. He says there's no justification for the long O, but he kind of sticks with that general idea. But basically, I think it's a bit unlikely because arch is all to do with place and is only to do with being in one place. It's not to do with a movement, and there's not really strong evidence that it fits that. You know, a bridge is a way of getting across something, so there's a kind of an implied movement. Of course, the words pons and arch don't look very similar, but Irish loses initial P, you know, and the phonology may work, but may not. It's a very common word, as well as coming up in ordinary conversation. It occurs in some interesting Irish place names, often in combination with the word chach, meaning house. So you get arch chi, which is like place of the house, which seems to mean the house site where maybe there's a ruin and no longer actually a house. You know, not certain. So there's an example, Attibrick, Arch Chi Brick in County Tipperary. There's a lot of these, especially in the south. That combination is interesting. The Scottish form is interesting as well because it's got another vowel, archer. It is, however, masculine. So it's got two syllables, and I think the E is a relic of something in the origin. I'm proposing that it comes from the Latin word habitatio. Now you might go, what? What? Habitatio. Count the syllables. Habitatio. 5 syllables. Arch, 1. Archer, Scottish Gaelic, 2. Now, Irish and the Celtic languages generally lose a lot of syllables in between Proto-Celtic and the beginnings of the language. We don't usually kind of see it happening in the beginnings of the literature, but you usually lose 2 syllables out of a 4-syllable word anyway. Okay, it's gone a bit further here. H is going to drop anyway, of course, because Irish has no initial H. Okay, like many languages. I would argue that it is from habitatio. The 2 T's have come together. That's why it's sometimes spelt with 2 T's in Old Irish. the H is naturally lost anyway. There's other examples of the B being lost. So here's another example of a similarly drastically reduced loan word. Old Irish esarn, meaning 1-year-old wine, comes from Latin ex hibernum. Okay, that's 4 syllables down to 2, but the B has completely gone, hasn't it? Okay, next word, Allin, beautiful. Okay, Old Irish has 2 words, Allin, Allind. It can be written with a ND or it can be written with 2 N's, as in modern Irish. It means lovely, fine, splendid. And there's a similar word, just lind, meaning keen, eager, pleasant, bright. And that also comes through into some phrases in modern Irish. And the 2 words seem to be related. What's been suggested? Not much, actually. It's not covered by, this word is not, or we say the combination of lind and allind are not covered by many dictionaries. But McBain, dealing with Scottish Gaelic, and here Scottish Gaelic does have the same word as Irish, he says that lind is from the root splend, which you get in Latin splendidus, and which also gives us English splendid. So Latin splendidus, bright, shining, glittering, brilliant. But the problem with that is that this root is verbal, and you would expect something more to be on it, but it just stops after the splend. You know, so if the verb means shine, glitter, something like that, you'd expect some suffix on it to get, you know, glittering, as you do with splendidus in Latin. Okay, so, you know, that's a big doubt that I had. I suggest that it's actually from an early Romance form, not Latin in this case, but from something like Spanish lindo. The feminine of that is the name Linda, which means beautiful, beautiful woman. Okay, that has come from Latin limpidus, meaning clear, bright, limpid, or pure or clean. And allin, I think, is an intensifier prefix put in front of lin to make it very, very bright, very clear, and hence beautiful. Okay, which you can find other examples of. You'll notice this really only works if you work with either Spanish or something like Spanish or Italian, because these words have lindo. Okay, Italian has lindo, Portuguese has it, but French doesn't. For example, French has limpide, which goes back to the Latin limpidus, and you couldn't get the lind from that or from limpidus. Not easily. So, yeah, I'm suggesting that we need to consider the possibility that it's from Ibero-Romance, in other words, like a Romance dialect on the Iberian Peninsula, like Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, or Italian, because Italian has it too, not from Classical Latin or French. Okay, then when I went on to this word, then I really started to kind of think, there's something going on here, you know, because this was one where I'm really sure. Okay, a lot of you know this word barn, white. Yeah, it's in loads of place names. It seems to mean white in ordinary usage, but in place names it actually often means grassy, and it refers to agricultural land. Old Irish had 2 words, barn, which is usually translated as white, and find, which has become modern Irish fionn, meaning either white or bright or blonde. The name Fionn, like, you know, Fionn McCool, the giant, means he was blonde. But born has become the standard word in modern Irish. There are lots of explanations for this. McBain deals with it and Picorni deals with it, and they suggest that it is from a root that begins with a sort of baha, and going to be baha, bahor, and appears in various languages. But the nearest language that anyone can quote to Irish is Greek, which is a little bit kind of off-putting, you know, because we'd like to find something a bit nearer to Ireland, like Latin or like a Germanic language, you know. There's a Greek word phanos, okay, that's phanos meaning bright, and there's a verb phaino, I make visible or show. And I mean, you know, like the meaning, the connection is clear, you know. But there's a problem, because born doesn't only mean white. It can mean blank, or it can mean bald, or it can mean grassy, and hence it can refer to fallow land or lee land, land left empty, unused. And that's puzzling, because why would you get that meaning if the original meaning is kind of bright or shining, or even just white, you know? So there was a light bulb moment. I think this word is actually derived from an old Spanish word. The Spanish word is from Latin vanus, and that gives us in English vain. Vanus means empty, void, vacant, but it could also mean, you know, vacant in terms of personality, or superfluous. That's why vain gets its you know, that meaning in English. Okay, but in Spanish that word will be pronounced vano, because Spanish has a characteristic of pronouncing a V as a B, as you will know in, you know, names like Valencia, spelt with a V. Okay, and if it means empty, void, or vacant, that's it's perfectly logical that it means fallow land, because it's land left empty. So that's not a development. That's actually closer to the original meaning I'm suggesting. And I'm suggesting that the white aspect is a development. And that's not a problem, because if you look at what's happened with the word blank, blank is a Germanic root. In French, it's become blanc, which means white. But in English, blank means empty, like blank page. Yeah. So that there's a parallel for that kind of development. And only Spanish pronounces V as a B, so you can't get it from Latin or any other Romance dialect in this case, if you believe. Okay, realtor. Nearly at the end. Realtor, a star. Old Irish had a few words for star. There was rind, which meant a star or constellation. There's a word that means point, but it seems to be separate from that because it's a different declension. So it meant a star or a constellation, rind. And then there was also a rare word, not many attestations, ser, meaning a star. And then the word that realtor comes from in Old Irish was reitla, spelt like that, or sometimes spelt like that, or sometimes without the T, reila. And the Dictionary of the Irish Language actually comments there's lots of spelling variants of this, and the T isn't always there. Okay, and only realtor has really kind of become a common word for star in modern Irish. It doesn't have any cognates in Brittonic, so Welsh for star is ser or seren, which it obviously relates to this rare Irish word. And I was kind of thinking when I first looked at this word, is this a candidate for a pre-Celtic word that's come into Irish that has survived? You know, because I mean the stars were always there, and you were thinking, well, the megalith builders, they probably didn't speak a Celtic language, they probably didn't speak an Indo-European language, but they were looking at the stars and they were orientating their megaliths on them, saying, oh, this could be really old. But actually now I've come to completely the opposite conclusion. Okay. What previous explanations are there? there is a very, very early explanation in a very, very well-known source, Sanus Cormac, or Cormac's Glossary, compiled around 900 AD, possibly compiled by the Bishop King of Cashel, Cormac MacQuillenain, or possibly at his behest by other scholars. Okay, and this is the first Irish etymological source. It's not a dictionary, but it's a quite extensive glossary, and it deals with interesting words. And they spell it reitglu. They suggest reit gle, meaning bright thing, literally thing glowing. Okay, and that actually relates to the English word glowing, right? And surprisingly, this etymology is actually followed by the modern etymologists insofar as they deal with it. So MacBain and Vondries, the Lexique etymologique, they actually follow this, essentially, the Cormac's Glossary version. I really think this is an implausible folk etymology for a number of reasons. The spelling with the G is not very common, and you can argue that the spelling with the G is probably influenced by this folk etymology, but usually the G is not there. And there's just no need to have a word meaning thing in it, because you don't do that. The way that you build words, if you want to take a verbal root that means shine or glitter, that's glay, and you want to create something meaning something shining one, brilliant one, you don't add a word that means thing, and I mean there's no parallel for that in Irish. You just stick a suffix on it to make it into a noun, so I think that's very implausible. My suggestion is that this is actually from Old Spanish estrella, okay, or from some similar Ibero-Romance cognate, which could mean Portuguese or Catalan, but with the loss of est. Now that might seem drastic, but actually the E is only there in Spanish because Spanish doesn't like st at the beginning anyway, and it's actually added it because it comes from Latin stella, okay? So yeah, that you can understand why the E would drop, and the combination stra in Irish in loanwords becomes sra. So everything except the S, we're expecting to lose it anyway. And S is very often, like we call it, prosthetic, So there's lots of pairs where you have it with an initial S or without an initial S. Like there's crag, which we have in English, but also in Irish. There's scrag in Irish as a variant. And it changes the meaning not one bit. So Irish has a lot of words where the S comes and goes without changing. And I think that's what's happened here. And if I'm right, it has to be from Ibero-Romance because only these dialects have this intrusive R. French has étoile, okay, there's no R in that. Latin itself has stella, Italian has stella. So there's got to be an R because we've got realtà. The T is a development as well, but again, you need to check the blog for the kind of full details, but it's not a problem. Last one, Imad, meaning wood or timber. Old Irish had the word fidh, meaning wood, both in the sense of timber, the material, and an area of woodland. Fee is still the standard word for timber in Scottish Gaelic. So Scottish Gaelic doesn't have this word Imad. So it's quite unusual in Irish. It's only in Irish. Okay, it's not in Brittonic, but it's also not in the other Goidelic languages. And it appears to have entered Irish in the later Middle Ages. Doesn't appear to have been there at the earliest stages where fidh is used for timber. The best explanation, there was an article written by David Green in Celtica 4, and he suggests that it's from a root ad moin, Okay, and Moen kind of is to do with creation, and the ad is a common prefix, and he suggests that this means invents, devises, contrives, and he actually posits the form admonither in Old Irish, and he says that this would be in Old Irish athmad becomes modern Irish imad, that it's a verbal noun of this verb. But that semantically is a problem for me, because that would seem appropriate for an abstract noun if it means something like invention, composition, construction, but not for the actual material. And the other problem is that actually verbs with this mon are attested, but the actual admonitor is unattested, so his form is theoretical. There is domwinyathar in old early Irish, but not this form. Okay. So Green's explanation doesn't really explain why this athmad arrives late, and also why it's only in Irish, not in Scottish Gaelic. And to me, it looks like a loan word. Now, I think this is what it is. I think it's from the Spanish word ademado, okay, which means timbering or bracing. And that itself is from a word adema or ademe. Okay, you can either have an A or an E at the ending, and it means a brace or a strut, so which would have been wooden. And that word is attested as a technical term in Spanish for mining as timber that you use to hold up a tunnel in a mine. Okay. Early Irish also has a word, eidhem, which sort of means instrument, with an unlenited M, which is very unusual, which makes you think that that is a loan word as well, because it should otherwise be something like eidhev with single M, and that could come from this adema. Okay. Now, does anybody want to give me the Latin root of this? Better not, okay, because it's actually from Arabic, and that's why it's late, because it's come from Arabic into Spanish when the Moors conquered Spain, and I would suggest, which is like 7th century, and then from there into Irish. We know that there were foreigners involved in mining in Ireland. In the silver mines, we know that the first miners were actually specialized crews from Genoa. It's not inconceivable that there were earlier foreigners, perhaps from Spain. Okay. So, what does all of this mean? We seem to have a lot of links between Ireland and Spain, or the Iberian Peninsula, but sometimes really specifically Spain. That's the way the evidence from these few words is pointing. And I admit it's only a few words. Okay, I've got about 10 in all. It's often been remarked that there's a link between the Roman name Iberia and Hibernia. Aren't they similar? Okay. Hibernia, Ireland, is often explained jokingly as the land of winter, with reference to the fantastic weather. Okay, which wouldn't really do for Iberia. But more seriously, it is often suggested that they actually have a common root. Now, there's no consensus on this. There's actually lots of ideas about where like Iberia appears to be an ethnic root, and it seems to have the same root as the river Ebro, but where Hibernia and where Era, the Irish for Ireland, and the "ir" bit in the English Ireland comes from, there is no consensus. Okay. Now, as soon as you start talking about connections between Spain and Ireland, somebody brings up 1588 and the Armada, and there are very widespread kind of stories about the reason why people in Munster in particular have dark hair, and it's true. There's a lot more black-haired people in Kerry, Cork, Clare than there are up here in Ulster, is because of all those Spaniards who survived from the wrecks of the Armada. Now, of course, it's totally impossible that, such a recent, number of people descended from, such a small number of survivors would have accounted for a widespread characteristic. But it may contain an element of truth about much earlier links. I'm only going to mention other connections, and I'm just going to point them out, but not really say, what I think, because at the moment I don't know. Okay, and I haven't formed an opinion. In Leabhar go bhála Éireann, usually known as the Book of Invasions, which is a sort of work of kind of pseudo history, which is really kind of wrapped up with mythology. There's a group of invaders of Ireland. They're the last of 6 waves to invade Ireland, and we usually refer to them as the Milesians. They are the sons of Mil España. And his name literally is a Gaelicization of Miles Hispaniae, soldier of Spain. Okay? And it's believed that they arrived from Spain. However, their mother is Scotia, who is the daughter of an Egyptian pharaoh. So Spain wasn't the beginning of the story, but Spain was the point that they set off from to conquer Ireland. Princesses of Spain are very prevalent in Irish mythology. The 4 that I'm aware of, there's Bera, who gives her name to the Beara Peninsula. She's not the same as the Hag of Bera, or Colliach Vera, if you know her. Okay, she's a different character. She's just Bera. Okay. She is the wife of Owen Mór, who's also called Mug Nuadat, who was king of the southern half of Ireland in very early times. She was the daughter of a king of Spain, according to the legends. There's Tea, who was similarly the wife of an Irish king, one of these Milesians, King Eramon. And it's said that her name is commemorated in the name Chawer. Now that's Chawer, but it works much better in the spelling, doesn't it? It's supposed to be Tea Moor, Tea's wall. Of course, that's folk etymology too, but I'm saying there's a connection made, and that's Tara, where High Kings of Ireland were crowned. There's Tulcha, the Fir-Bolg Queen. There was a great fair held also in County Meath at Tulcha, and it's said that was to commemorate her. She was also a Spanish princess, and in an alternative legend to the first one, Owen Mór went to Spain. He was invited to Spain, and there he married the daughter of the King of Spain called Momera. And of course, Momera is not very different from Bera. The tale is called Tochwark Momera, the wooing of Momera. Okay, lots of kind of legendary connections. Cultural interactions. There's plenty if you want to go looking for them. The works of Saint Isidore of Seville, who was a bishop of Seville, lived in the late 6th, early 7th century. Like Cormac, he wrote a work. Wasn't just etymologies. It was more like an encyclopedia, but there was a part that was also about real etymologies. It was called Etymologiae, in Latin. Not in Spanish, in Latin, okay? And that was a well-known text in Ireland as early as the late 7th century, okay? We know that was known to kind of learned Irish people by the late 7th century, not too long after he actually lived. And then, pilgrimage, you have Irish pilgrims regularly went to Santiago de Compostela, and still do, but that was going on throughout the Middle Ages. And there were fewer, but Spanish pilgrims coming, for example, to Loch Derg in County Donegal. So lots of contact if you want to go and look for it. I don't know what the answer is, but that needs to be investigated further, I think. Okay, because what I'm finding here basically is that there's a small but substantial body of words that look like they've come into Irish from early Spanish, maybe nearly as significant as words borrowed from Norse, like the Viking borrowings into Irish, but earlier. It may have been hidden because, like Isidore wrote in Latin. Latin was the written language until about the 10th century, and then from about 11th century, suddenly we get texts in the Romance languages, so in Old Spanish, in Old Portuguese, Old French, and so on. Up to the 10th century, they continued writing in Latin, but nobody believes that they were really speaking classical Latin, or even vulgar Latin, but that it was probably very heavily influenced and had a lot of characteristics of the modern local dialect, of modern Spanish, or of modern Portuguese, or of modern French. But it's just that they didn't admit, they knew that their language came from Latin and continued to write it as Latin. And at some point, the discrepancy became so large that they said, no, we can't do this anymore. We can't keep pretending that we're really speaking Latin. So, changes like the, wanos becoming bano probably happened long, long before, many centuries before they're actually written down, because Spanish wasn't written down. That's my suggestion. Okay, I know I've talked long enough. Cormac MacQuillanine, that's in St Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, most well-known Irish etymologist, most well-known early Spanish etymologist and scholar generally, Isidore, Bishop of Seville. And that's some of my kind of most important sources that I've mentioned. Okay. So thank you very much. Sorry for running on a bit. Yeah, by all means.
Just time for a few questions here.
If you've got time, I've got time.
How easy would Patrick have found to communicate with the native Irish?
It's never mentioned that he needed a translator. I don't think. And Latin was the language of the church. So presumably they could communicate in Latin if their Celtic languages, if their native languages weren't close enough anyway. They probably did communicate in Latin all the time. They were fluent in it, but just it may have been medieval Latin, in his case with a Brittonic accent, So. Yeah, it's a very moot question, but again, it's again difficult to answer because a lot of the Irish sources, early Irish sources, are in Latin, especially the religious texts, and then only several centuries later do you start to get a lot of religious texts. But I mean, he wrote in Latin. The two documents of Patrick's that have survived are in Latin, not in. For example, Old Welsh or Old Irish or anything Celtic.
Is there a cave spelled there?
I'm hoping that somebody can tell me. I don't know of there being one. There is another feature nearby called Spellac, which is on the Trassy track, if you know that. Yeah, and that's a crag, and so. I mean, Spelga itself is also a hill. Now, although the dam has flooded the Deer's Meadow, I don't think there was any major rock feature there. And the hill itself is not particularly rocky either, so it's a bit of a mystery. But that does seem to be the meaning of it. But the Spellac is a very distinctive crag that's visible on a hill that you pass as you go up the Trassy track. So if somebody knows of a cave, I would be very interested to hear about it, but in the meantime I'll assume that it's the meaning that's developed to just rock or crack.
You said that some of those words might have been common before the Latin and the Celtic languages. If you look at northwestern Spain, for example, I'll actually write down that coast. In prehistoric times, Neolithic times, the monuments there are really very similar to our Neolithic monuments. So, you know, the language of those people, you know, there could have been surely a common, there must have been links for them to be so ssimilar.
Yeah. And the archaeologists, for example, are finding more and more of those links. Like, I mean, I'm trying to think, Barry Cunliffe, isn't it? Wrote the book Facing the Ocean about, what was it, 15 to 20 years ago? About 15 years ago, kind of all about early sea links along the Atlantic between Britain, Ireland, France, Iberian Peninsula, and North Africa. Yeah, indeed. I mean, you know, I could have added a lot more onto that page where I was talking about links. You can go in all kinds of directions.
Because by the time they stopped writing in Latin, I mean, the other languages were well developed by that time. There was so much more trade and commerce going on. People didn't actually write.
Exactly. You know. Yeah.
What this did to what might have been the very original tongue is extremely difficult, I think, given that
it is. It is. It's very, very problematic, and I think that little hints, like the fact that, you know, born looks like it's come from Spanish and it looks like a V has changed into a B, you know, it's the little glints of light suggesting something. But a lot of the time we'd like to have a lot more information. You know, we'd like to have earlier texts, we'd like to have more texts on particular subjects, and, you know, I mean, we'd like to have texts about mining, for instance, but I mean, you know, they're not there till about the 18th century, you know, and in English mainly, you know, so it's very difficult.
Are there parts of Ireland that have more of these Latin influenced names?
There's a few words where you can definitely see that if the words occur in place names, that there's definitely a southern tendency. So there's a word that's on my to-do list, which is lyre, okay, which is also feminine, and it's usually explained as meaning hoof or paw of an animal, or the space between your fingers in reference to the human anatomy. And it does, but in place names, it's often said that it means, it's the same word, and it means a confluence of streams, or if you're looking upstream, like a fork, you know, and it's because of this idea of, you know, the split between fingers, or the split in the hoof, or something like that. But I think it's another word that, you know, I think it's a homonym, and it's from latera, which is the plural of latus, meaning sides, and you know, it's a neuter word. In the plural, it's latera. Neuter plurals very often get then treated in Romance as feminine singulars because it ends with a. The grammar's not too good. Okay, and a lot of the Irish place names with lyre in them just look like they mean slope. They're just the slope of a hill. And Spanish has this word, ladera. And if it comes from Spanish, then it will be lyre. Whereas if it came from Latin, it will be lahar. So it's not a lenited T, it's a lenited D. That lyre is very, very common in the south of Ireland. And there's another word, fe, meaning a sort of a bog stream in a bog or stream in a swamp. That's also got a very specifically southern distribution. But then some other words like born, well, maybe just because it was such a common word, is all over Ireland. Do you know?
Just on that, it's interesting because actually the name is Skellig. The source of the wagon is on a mountain in the Moors, and I'm just thinking it's
On Slieve Croob. On Slieve Croob.
And it's Hoof Mountain, isn't it? But I've also
Yeah, if it's Irish, but yeah, if it's Irish, but there's a word that just means hump.
Just means I have that would be,
You see, and there's no legend to kind of relate it to the hoof, as far as I know. Is there, Pat? Or does anybody else know?
I've always heard it explained as the hoof.
Yeah, it's understood as that, and there's no doubt about that. But there's an element, for example, in Welsh, and if Irish had the same element, you know, crwb just means a lump or a mound, and then I know, but unfortunately, place names are often banal, accurate and banal, and especially hill names tend to be very banal. One of them is called Crotleave, which is got the Irish element, definitely an Irish element. Crot meaning lump or hunch or something like that, like hunchback. You know, Crotleave, like lump, mountain. You know, so then, you know, if that's one of the outliers of Slieve Croob, then it kind of seems believable that Slieve Croob also has got the same kind of meaning. Heresy.
Well, we worked our speaker very hard this evening, so I wonder if John, do you want to...
Thank you very much. I should explain the puzzle, shouldn't I? Yeah. Does anybody worked it out? No, it's in Spain. Yeah, it's in Spain. It's a Roman lighthouse. I dare say it's been modified since Roman time. It's known as the sort of Tower of Hercules. It's very near A Coruña, but it's associated with a Celtic legend. And the legend is that one of the ancestors of the Milesians, Breogan, had it built, and then one of his descendants went up it, and on a fine evening, looked out, fantastic sunset, all clear, and in the distance in the ocean spotted this amazing, tempting island that turned out to be Ireland. And then his descendants then went and invaded, and they were the sons of Mel, the Milesians. Okay? So that's the connection.